Today we're going to talk about section 5.1, which is polynomial equations. This should be a big time review, and you should have gotten this stuff down from previous chapters, so hopefully this will solidify everything that we had. We're going to apply the factor and rational root theorems that we learned in chapter 2 to find roots of polynomial equations, and we're going to solve polynomial equations. In chapter 2, we learned about the factor theorem that said that if we set our polynomial equal to 0 and we get a solution r, which is a real number, then we have this factor that's x minus r. And then we also learned a theorem called the rational root theorem, where if we had this polynomial like this, we knew that all our possible solutions were this fraction, c over d, where c was all the factors of our constant, and d was all the factors of our leading coefficient. So hopefully that's review. Make sure you know those. If you have to look back to chapter 2 to make sure you've got those, do so. All right, so let's see. What if we want to solve this equation? Okay, so this is a polynomial. So we know that it's a third degree polynomial, which means it has to have 3 roots, which is the answers when we set it equal to 0. Remember, the roots are all the x values when we set the polynomial equal to 0. So first we look at our possibilities. What are our possibilities? Well, all of the factors of 8 are plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 4, and plus or minus 8. And all the factors of 2 are just plus or minus 1 and plus or minus 2. So we put that together and we get all our possible roots are plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 4, plus or minus 8, and plus or minus 1/2. If we put these other ones over 2, we just end up repeating these things again. So these are our possibilities. So usually, remember, we would use synthetic division, and we would set up our little box over to the side and put our coefficients, our third degree, then our second, our first, and 0. Make sure you have 1 for every one, 3, 2, 1, 0. If you have a missing piece, then you have to put a 0 coefficient in there. Don't forget that. So once we have this, we can start testing them. You can test 1 and -1 and +2, and we're going to go ahead and test -2. So we multiply, remember, and add, and then multiply, and add, and then multiply, and add. And this is what we want, 0 at the end, because this tells us that now we have 2x squared minus 7x minus 4. And this says that we have this factor x minus -2. So, go up here and get us some room. We have one of the factors listed, and now we're down to a quadratic. So when we have a quadratic, we know how to factor those without synthetic division. We can do it with just looking at it, hopefully, if it factors nicely. So far what we've got is we've got x minus -2, so that's x plus 2. And then we need to factor this one down here. So we know we're going to have 2x, and we're going to have x. We have to figure out what things are going to multiply to give us this -4, and then when we multiply in this 2, we're going to get the -7. So if we do that, we have 2x plus 1 and x minus 4, because here we have -8 plus 1, so that's going to give us our -7. So this whole thing factors down to this. All right, so look at that and make sure you know how to do that. So we started out with synthetic division to get our first factor, and then once we got down to a quadratic, we didn't need that anymore. So we could look at it and just figure it out. All right, that should be review. So slow down and go back and make sure you've got that if it's not. Once we have it factored all the way, well, we know that if we're multiplying some things together and the product is equal to 0, that means that one of those factors has to be 0. So our possible roots are when x plus 2 equals 0, when 2x plus 1 equals 0, and when x minus 4 equals 0. Those are our answers. So we get x is negative 2, x is negative 1/2, and x is 4. So those are our roots. Those are our answers to this equation because we first factored it and then we ended up with all our roots. All right, let's try one more. Let's say we have x to the 6th minus x to the 4th minus 16x squared plus 16 equals 0. So how many roots are we going to have? Well, it's a 6th degree, so we're going to have 6 roots. And what are all our possibilities? Well, this is a leading coefficient of 1, so all we have to pay attention to is the factors of this constant. So we've got plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 4, plus or minus 8, and plus or minus 16. So we need to set up our synthetic division here. Now, make sure you pay attention. Here's the 6th degree, then there's no 5th, so we have to put a 0 in. Then 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Make sure you get all those in there. If you have a 6th degree, you should have 7 coefficients. So let's start with 1 and test that. So actually, let's move this up here so we have enough room later. All right, so we've got 1, bring it down, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add. Okay, so this gives us this factor here means we've got x minus 1 as a factor, and this here means we've got x to the 5th plus x to the 4th minus 16x minus 16 is what's left. So we're going to need to keep going with our synthetic division. So this time let's try negative 1. Bring down our 1, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add, multiply, add. And here we end up with this factor is x minus negative 1. And here we have x to the 4th minus 16. Now this one, it's not a quadratic, but it is a difference of squares. And when you have a difference of squares, it factors very nicely. So you need to realize that it's a difference of squares and that we can take the square root of each one and we get a plus and a minus and we end up factoring it to this. Now this one here will factor even further. So the first one doesn't because it's not a difference of squares, but this one is a difference of squares as well. So we can factor that like this. So this whole equation here, we've got 1 factor, 2 factors, 3, 4, and then this is going to give us 5 and 6 because it's our square one. So now we have x minus 1 times x plus 1 times x minus 2 times x plus 2 times x squared plus 4 equals 0. So again, we've got a product that equals 0, so that means it's going to happen anytime any of the factors equal 0. So x minus 1 equals 0, x plus 1 equals 0, x minus 2 equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0, and x squared plus 4 equals 0. So these are pretty straightforward. X equals 1, x equals negative 1. Oops. x equals 2, x equals negative 2. Now this one we end up with x squared equals negative 4, which means that x is going to be plus or minus 2i. So that's where we get our other two answers from. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 answers. So here's all our solutions, all our roots for this polynomial because it solves the equation when we set the polynomial equal to 0. So that's all there is to it. Hopefully this was review because you should have already covered this from chapter 2 and gotten it down then. If you're still having trouble with it though, make sure that you look back at chapter 2 and go over these things carefully. Be sure to read 5.1, have notes on all of it ready for the next class.